Thanks very much, and happy to be with you here this morning. When I asked the organizers of the conference what they would like to talk about, I gave them an array of options. Some were about agile teams, some were about agile organizations, and there was one which was about my new book coming out in December, Reinventing Capitalism in the Digital Age. And to my great pleasure and surprise, they chose Reinventing Capitalism in the Digital Age. And so we'll be looking at this set of issues and showing how it relates to the set of agile questions that we all have been struggling with over the last 20 years. And I'm actually going to be suggesting that you get together into small groups and form a nodule of 3 or 4 people together and answer some questions, which I will be putting to you. So I'd like to suggest that you spend 2 minutes now forming your group, forming your nodule. Find 2 or 3 people that you would like to interact with, introduce yourself, find out why they're here, find out their background, and you'll be having some interactive tasks to deal with that. So let's take 2 minutes just to get to know the members of your group. Good. So I'll assume that you've now met and you've formed your group, and we can start looking at some of the questions we'll be talking about. And I see you're continuing to talk, so that's good. It may be difficult to get you to stop talking, which is also good. And we are talking about capitalism. And what is capitalism? Well, until about a year ago, I must say, I was not very clear on what capitalism is. And so we have this, it turns out, very well agreed definition of what most experts, economists, management people think is capitalism. And their definition is capitalism means an economic system. It's an economic system. It's based on the private ownership of the means of production. That is, private companies own the means of production rather than the state, and their operation for profit. These are firms that are pursuing profit. That is the definition of capitalism. So in your group, what I want you to think about is, do you think this is good for us? Do you think this is bad for us? Do you think this is a mix of the good and bad? Or you just don't know? Maybe you'll find out during the course of the group. So let's take a minute to discuss in your group which of these options you think about capitalism, just to get an idea of the mood of the group. Because I sometimes hear that young people think capitalism is a very bad idea, whereas others think it's a good idea. I just want to get a sense of, in this group, what is your starting point for this discussion? So let's take a minute in your group. What is your group's feel about capitalism? Okay, let's come back together again and come back together again. And let's have a show of hands. Who thinks that capitalism is good for us? Hard to see with the lights here. Some hands. Who thinks capitalism is bad for us? Some hands. Who thinks capitalism is a mix of good and bad? Almost everyone. And who doesn't know? You'll find out. I guarantee it. This book is about a crisis of capitalism, which has occurred, become apparent in the last few years, but has been building for some time. It is a crisis about increasing income and wealth gaps, decline of the middle class, threats to employment, and some of the most successful firms of the 20th century have gone into decline. And so I too am with the bulk of the audience here, capitalism has many strengths, but it also is going through a difficult phase. And if you look over the last 500 years, capitalism for the human race has been a huge, massive economic success. Unimaginable the living conditions today, 500 years ago, even 200 years ago. Massive, massive changes. Poverty has been reduced from around 80% to down 20%. Literacy, health conditions, life expectancy, pretty much everything has gotten better. And part of that, not all of it, part of it has been a result of capitalism, private sector creating new means of increasing income. But the last 50 years have been a difficult patch. I've called it in the book an aberration of capitalism. And that is that big firms, particularly in the US and UK, have focused on a single goal: profit for the shareholders and the executives. Maximizing shareholder value has been the single-minded goal of big firms in the US and UK, but to some extent all around the world. And during that period, while executives and firms have made huge amounts of money, workers' pay has tended to stagnate. While executive compensation over the last 30 years rose almost 1,000%. So there's huge differences which have created these tensions that we see all around the world, but particularly in US and in Europe. And we can see in this graph how that has happened, that in the period prior to 1970, the workers shared with the firm and the executives the gains of their increases in productivity. They were in lockstep with the gains that the firm was making. In the last 50 years, that has parted. The workers basically have gotten very little of the gains, and the firms and the executives have gotten most of it. So there is a real problem that has been recorded in numbers, and it's a hard fact of the economy. And shareholder capitalism, this didn't happen overnight, it happened over time. If you think about the first 200 years or first 100 years of modern capitalism from 1770, Adam Smith, to 1870, business was generally about making money, but it was also perceived as benefits for workers and benefits for society. There was no rigid view about the goal of the firm. In the next period, 1870 to 1983, big firms began emerging. They hadn't appeared really until the end of the 19th century, and they started to appear, and so they started to have managers. And so the question became, what was the goal that these managers who were acting on behalf of the shareholders, what goal should they be pursuing? In the period 1970 to 1990, a couple of writers became very influential. Milton Friedman, Michael Jansen. Profits became the only goal of the firm, and they persuaded big firms that this should be the goal of the firm, single-minded goal of the firm. And in 1997, several hundred firms got together in the Business Roundtable in the US and declared this was the gospel of capitalism. Firms for capitalism should be pursuing profit solely for their shareholders. Other concerns would be dealt with indirectly. In 2019, they reversed themselves and announced that that had been a very bad idea. There was tremendous problems that had arisen from pursuing the goal like that. And they renounced this idea and said in future firms should be benefiting all the stakeholders. In the last couple of years since 2019, critics have said that was a head fake. That was just a cover-up. In fact, most firms did not change at all after this 2019 declaration. They kept on doing what they'd been doing before. They had not asked for the board of directors to change the goal of the firm. And this was a head fake, a cover-up of the fact they continue to pursue shareholder capitalism. And this way of running a firm, in some ways, has been very successful in the 20th century. The goal is a total focus on making money. And the way of structuring the firm is to have individuals reporting to bosses, basically bureaucracy. And the reason for this is that most people working in the firm don't really get motivated to generate value for shareholders or for the executives. It's not a very motivating goal. So you have to control the workers if you're going to pursue this role. So you naturally end up with bureaucracy. And it's top-down hierarchy, a culture of control to make sure that everyone is focused on making money. And the processes support these principles. Leadership is transactional. It's about making outputs. Strategy and innovation, it's about improving the existing business. Don't waste time creating new businesses. Sales, it's about making sales targets, whether or not the customer gets any benefit from the sales. Technology, support the existing business. And the budget typically is a battle among the silos in the hierarchy as to who get which share of the budget. And HR, human resources, about maintaining control. That is a pattern you see in organization after organization in the 20th century, and it was successful in its day. And let's have a show of hands. Let's, first of all, in your group, consider these questions, and then we'll have a show of hands. So get back in your group again, and there will be 4 possibilities. 1, I work in a firm that practices this form of shareholder capitalism. Or 2, I work in a firm that does not practice shareholder capitalism. Or 3, I don't work in a firm. Or 4, I don't know. So let's spend a minute in your group thinking about, in the 3 or 4 organizations which you represent, which question represents most of the firms in your little group. Okay, 1 minute. Okay, let's have a show of hands. Which groups are composed of people who work in a firm that practices shareholder capitalism? Wow. I'm not surprised, but that is rather alarming. No, I work in a firm that does not practice shareholder capitalism. Somewhat less, and quite a bit less. And I don't work in a firm. Everyone works in a firm. And I don't know. Anyone? No? Okay, so you are living the life of shareholder capitalism for the most part, which is not surprising. And this way of organizing, I mean, I put the characteristics in the last slide in a list, but in fact, they fit together as a system. They fit together as a coherent, internally consistent system. And that is one reason why this way of running a company has lasted so long, even though it's not particularly pleasant or agreeable to be part of. But because it fits together as a system, it is very robust. And so, although it makes a lot of money, because it's totally focused on making money and doesn't care about whether the firm is destroying its long-term future or whether it's doing something bad for society or the environment. It makes a lot of money, but it has limitations on how it can evolve. I mean, if one of the things for which this is most important for Agile is that when you have some new practice or process that comes into a firm that is operating like this, it's not as I suspected in 2010 when I had come across Agile, and I thought, well, this is obviously a better way to run an organization. I had suffered in a bureaucracy for several decades in the 20th century, and I was looking around for a better way to run organizations, and I came across Agile, and I said, wow, this is amazing. Finally, some signs of intelligent life in the corporate universe. But they had been hard to find up till then. But I said, well, this is amazing. And obviously what will happen is that once firms start doing this, they will see that this is a better way to run the organization, and it will spread throughout the whole organizations. And very soon you'll see whole organizations which are Agile. But of course, I was naive, and the opposite happened, that the system functions like an autoimmune system of the body. So when a strange thing enters into this hierarchical bureaucracy like Agile, every part of the organization wheels into action to crush it. Maybe not on day one, but on day 2 or day 3. The budget, the strategy, the operations, HR, everyone starts finding reasons why this way of running the organization doesn't fit, shouldn't exist, has to go away, and find ways to stifle the Agile movement. And it's the same really with other parts of the organization. There are many innovative ideas on how to do strategy in a better way, and the same thing happens there. You might introduce a blue ocean strategy, which is a much better way of handling strategy than the 20th century, but you get the same phenomenon. The whole of the organization bears down. What is this strange thing that's happening in strategy? This doesn't fit our whole mode of operating the way we've operated for 10 years, 20 years, 100 years. We have to crush it. We have to stop it. We have to end it. So this is a very robust way of running an organization, but it makes change very hard. And so it's quite worrying when you're trying to advance Agile to be dealing with these kinds of organizations. And these firms, however, although they made a lot of money, and some of them still making a lot of money, they ran into a whole series of problems. First, this hierarchical bureaucracy was not a good way to deal with the new digital technology. The digital technology started to change everything, and of course that's why Agile got underway in the first place, is that in software you had to handle it differently. You couldn't use bureaucracy to run software programs. And industrial firms, old industrial firms, found they couldn't adapt to the rapid changes that were happening in the marketplace. And also customers had more power. Customers could now find out what was available on the marketplace. They could make comparisons between offers. They could have reliable information. And so customers became very, very powerful in the marketplace. And firms that didn't take account of the power of the marketplace ran into trouble. There were also abuses and inequalities caused by this way of running the firm. And the firms made steadily less money. Although the goal of the firm was to make more money, in fact, it turned out to be a way of destroying shareholder value. Over time, these firms like GE, IBM, had been the global giants of the 20th century. They were finding it very difficult to compete in the 21st century. And so in the 21st century, a different kind of management emerged. And it emerged before Agile appeared on the scene. In 1954, Peter Drucker gave the primary insight for this whole movement is that there is only one valid goal for a corporation, only one, to create a customer, only one valid goal. Now, although he was probably the most famous management theorist in the world, no one paid any attention to his insight. It languished really for 50 years until it was taken up by the Agile Manifesto, and in software started to spread like wildfire. It was the first principle of the Agile Manifesto. And by 2010, Agile had begun spreading beyond technology, and as I had hoped would happen, but it was still on a fairly small scale. In 2011, the Wall Street Journal suddenly realized that these software firms were eating the world. They were making a fortune. They were becoming much more valuable than anyone had imagined, and more valuable than other firms. By 2015, these software firms had become the most valuable firms on the planet. And so what happened in the next 5 years was that almost every big firm wanted part of it. They wanted a digital transformation. They wanted to get the benefits that were flowing to these firms that had mastered this different way of running the organization. And the most important element of this change is this goal, a shift from maximizing shareholder value to maximizing customer value. Different ways of expressing it, different wordings, and the wordings don't matter. It is the underlying sense that this is the be-all and the end-all of successful organizations in the 20th century. So you have Peter Drucker's formulation, you have co-creating value for customers, you have an obsession with customer value. Haier, the Chinese firm, has zero distance to the customer. Making money is the result, not the goal of the firm. Or one I like, loving the customer as yourself. All of these different wordings are about this central idea that this is a different way of thinking about corporations and about work. And I've sometimes called this appropriate to be here in Poland, a Copernican revolution in management. The Copernican revolution in astronomy was people had taken the evidence of their senses that obviously the sun revolved around the earth every day. You could see it. Copernicus, a very smart guy, figured out that it's the opposite. In fact, the earth revolves around the sun. And he didn't change anything with that. It was a different way of looking at the world. But many things did change as a result of that, because whole sections of government and church and religion changed. They were no longer plausible once you realized that the sun was the center of our galaxy and the Earth was not the center of the universe. We were simply one planet, and we were revolving around the sun. And in management, in a sense, the same thing happened. Before this customer capitalism, the firm was the center of the universe, and customers were floating around on the periphery, and management was about doing what was going on inside the corporation. This new way of running the organization reverses that, and instead the customer is the center of the organization, and the firms are on the periphery, revolving around the customer and trying to get the attention, trying to see what they could do that would make the lives of the customer better. So although it is simply a different way of thinking about the world, a different way of feeling about the world, it in fact changes everything about the world. It's something that Copernicus did in astronomy, now Peter Drucker has done in management. And so I have a show of hands. These questions, first, my work is totally committed to co-creating value for customers and users. Yes, no, or not sure. Or I can see how my work positively impacts customers and end users. And 3, my firm is totally committed to co-creating value for customers and end users. So let's go back into your small groups for a minute or so and discuss which is your answer on each of these 3 questions, and then we'll have a show of hands on those 3 questions. Okay? One of my favorite books is a book called Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber, and it's about jobs that people are doing for which even the people doing the jobs can see there is no point. They can see that they have to do the job, they've been told to do the job, but they can see that no customer, no one is getting any benefit from what they're doing, but they just keep doing it. And in many organizations, this amounts to as much as 40% of what the firm is actually doing. And this customer capitalism is really about getting to the heart of that and showing any work that is not adding value to customers needs to be eliminated. So let's take the first question. My work is totally committed to co-creating value for customers and users, and the choices are yes, no, or not sure. So who votes yes? My work is totally committed to co-creating value for customers. A good proportion of you. Who is not totally committed to creating value for customers? A few, not too many. And who is not sure? Quite a few. Let's take the second question. I can see how my work positively impacts customers and end users. Who is voting yes? Most of you, right? Who cannot see how their work is impacting customers? Some. And who's not sure? Quite a few. And finally, my firm is totally committed to co-creating value for customers and end users. Who votes yes? Oh, quite good. Who votes no? Yeah, quite a few. And who is not sure? Yeah, I can understand. So let's move on. What has happened is that firms run it in this new way. When they're totally focused on the customer and have processes that support that, they are able to move more quickly, they can operate more efficiently, they can mobilize more resources, they can attract more talent, they can win over customers more easily and enjoy much elevated market capitalization. And so the most successful exponents of this way of operating have become the most valuable firms on the planet, while the former giants are in decline. And as a result, most big firms are attempting to do this. Most big firms are trying to use digital technology to become a digital giant. So a different way of management has emerged, and it has a new goal, a total focus on co-creating value for customers. And work is no longer individuals reporting to bosses, but self-organizing teams focused on outcomes. At the early days of Agile, I think most of us focused on small teams, 5 to 7 people. What's happened in the last few years, we see many organizations like Amazon or like Roche Pharmaceuticals, is that they are finding that the tasks are too big to be handled by small teams, and so you're starting to see much larger teams. So they're not small anymore. They might be 20, they might be 50 people working on a common goal, but they are self-organizing and they are totally focused on customers. And the structure of the firm shifts from this vertical hierarchy with big bosses telling medium-sized bosses who tell little bosses what to do, and messages go up and down the hierarchy. Instead, there is a network of competence so that issues are dealt with by the most competent people in the network. So those are the principles which then lead on to a different set of processes. And principles drive the processes, and processes drive the individuals in the firm. So the leadership is inspirational, achieving outcomes, not transactional, focused on outputs. And strategy and innovation is not just improving the existing business, but creating new businesses. And sales is not about making a certain proportion of sales or a fixed target of sales, but making customers' lives better. And technology is used to transform the business, not just to support the business and the budget. Now the budget is a support to the rest of the organization, not the place where strategy issues are fought out in a battle among the silos. And HR, instead of aiming at controlling the staff to correspond to the profit-making goals of the firm, now HR is about creating and energizing the staff and creating a spirit of creativity and innovation. Those are a radically different set of principles and processes from the 20th century. And they are very, very compatible with Agile and everything that you're talking about in this conference. And they, like the bureaucratic industrial era arrangements, they fit together as an interactive system. They are mutually supportive. And so if you can get functioning in this way, then if a contrary process starts to come into the organization, a bureaucratic process, the other pieces of the firm will start to interact and say, why are you going back into that old way of doing things? They will start to support the firm to keep moving forward in this different way. And There are very few firms that have completed this whole transition, but many, many firms are now in train and underway to get into this different way of operating the organization. And firms that were born like this have sometimes done well, but there are very few of them that have continued, because firms must continue to evolve. This is not like a fixed agenda. This is something that has to evolve as the environment, the context changes quite dramatically over time. And so this digital transformation is a massive challenge. You have a firm like Microsoft, 100 and something thousand employees, or Roche Pharmaceuticals, 50,000 employees. Imagine you have those scores of thousands of people operating on the left-hand side. They've been operating like that for 10, 20, 50, maybe 100 years, and it's become second nature to the organization. How do you make that change? And that's what the challenge is. And what we found in talking with organizations is that the management at the top is often not very keen about undertaking this. They don't want to change, they don't know how to change, and they are being paid by the board of directors not to change. A lot of boards are saying, don't get into this crazy innovation stuff, just go on making money. And when you have that kind of leadership, the organization will certainly not progress to the digital age management. It will remain in the industrial era management. And those firms that are trying often make the mistake of thinking this is just buying new technology. Let's buy some artificial intelligence, let's buy some experts who know how to operate it and stick them in the IT department, and we'll become a digital organization. They don't realize that this is not primarily about technology, it's primarily about a different way of running the whole organization. And so we've developed this a diagnostic tool that firms and units and teams can assess where they are in this process of transformation. And so it takes on the left-hand side, the processes and principles that I outlined earlier, and on the right-hand side, it has the processes and principles of the digital way of managing, and enables you to fill in a sense, where you are, where your team, where your unit, or your organization is in this transformation. And to show how that can illustrate what happens in an organization, we take one organization in Silicon Valley at 4 moments in time. This was actually SRI International. It was the inventor of the Siri gadget that you have on your iPhone. And in 1998, SRI International was a firm pictured in the top left of this chart. It was basically being run almost entirely in this industrial era bureaucratic hierarchical manner. The processes and the principles were all aligned, but they were aligned in the wrong direction. And they, in 1998, acquired a new CEO, Kurt Carlson, who came in with the opposite goal. He came in with the idea that he would turn this into a digital age organization. And so he spent the first 2 years trying to persuade several thousand staff, it's a relatively small organization, to change their whole mindset, to be thinking not about making money, but about creating value for customers, creating new ideas for customers. And it took him several years, discussions, daily discussions in the cafeteria, in meetings, over and over again. This is where we're going. This is where we're heading. And many things had to happen. Of the 10 direct reports that he had when he arrived in the first year, 9 of those leaders disappeared. They didn't want any part of it. They didn't like what they were hearing. They vanished, and so the organization moved ahead much lighter without them. So by 2000, he had made quite a bit of progress, but it was still really halfway home. After 2 years of persuasion and argument and working out how to create new businesses, still had a great deal of work to do. And it was really another 3 to 5 years before the whole organization was in sync with this new way of operating. He left the organization in 2014, and his view was that the whole organization had moved to that point to this new way of operating. But at that point, 2014, when he left, the board appointed a new CEO who had a very traditional view of management. And so the next 6 years, in fact, the firm went backwards to the old way of operating. And so this was not a permanent change. So this is a continuous battle to keep the organization moving in this direction. You might say that he had made a mistake in not co-opting the board of directors so that they appointed a successor who would carry on the work. But in any event, they didn't appoint that, and it went backwards. But the somewhat happy ending is that the new CEO of SRI International has brought back the same energy and spirit that Kurt Carlson had, and so it is now rejoining that journey. So that is an example of a firm that is undertaken this journey. It shows that it's not simple, it's not easy, it's not quick. It takes a lot of energy and hard effort to make it happen, a lot of persuasion, and some people are not going to make it. Some people are simply not part of the change, and they really need to move on to some other career. Microsoft is another successful transition. In 2014, when Satya Nadella took over as the new CEO, he inherited a company which was really very much stuck in the 20th century way of running. They were focused on making money. They had bureaucratic processes. Their culture was very combative and confrontational. They had good technology, but they were very inept in taking advantage of it. And Satya Nadella came in and said, we are going to run this firm differently, and said we are going to be totally focused on creating value for the customer. We are going to be mobilizing the agile teams that we already have. As it happened, since 2008 to 2014, under the cover of dark, agile had been spreading within Microsoft. But it was not a popular thing, and so the top management didn't want to hear about it. When Satya Nadella became CEO, he was part of that agile movement, and so the agile teams came out of the shadows, and they took over the organization instead of being pushed around. Now they were pushing around the whole organization. And of course, some of the leadership were not comfortable in this new environment, and some of those left because Nadella put a huge emphasis on empathy for the customers, understanding their needs, understanding their role. And whenever you had a meeting with him, you had to start with what's happening to the usage of our work. Is it being used? Why is it being used? How is it being used? You couldn't have any discussion about anything. Couldn't discuss profits, you couldn't discuss revenue, you couldn't discuss anything unless and until you had discussed the customer. And that kind of thinking spread throughout the whole organization, and it, of course, turned out to be extremely profitable. It added another $1.2 trillion to the market capitalization of Microsoft, and way ahead of the S&P 500. So this illustration of how this way of running an organization, although it's not focused on making money, in fact makes more money than firms that are focused on making money. One firm that is mainly focused on making money, JP Morgan, I was talking about with one of the participants last night, is a firm that is not focused on the customer. Its goal is to become the most respected banking institution in the world. And it has made quite a bit of money, But recently, this last year, it has been trying to implement a digital transformation and has put billions and billions of dollars into creating a digital banking business in the UK. And to the CEO's disappointment, Jamie Dimon, who wants to become a digital giant, the stock market took a very cautious view about this idea of JP Morgan becoming a digital organization when it isn't focused on the customer. And so he's been having an argument with the stock market for the last, 8-9 months, where he's had meetings, he's had sessions, he's had workshops, he's had briefings of the stock market, and the stock market is not convinced that this is going to lead to anything, because there's not even within JP Morgan itself, it's not seen to be profitable for another 5 years. So the stock market is saying, we can't see that you have a realistic plan to make banking in UK better as a result of your digital investments, and so we're not going to give you any credit for it, much to his frustration. And they are doing worse than the S&P 500 average in terms of their market capitalization. And so they are really being run in what I call this industrial era bureaucratic hierarchical management. They are all on the left side of this chart. And in a sense, we are looking at a new age. I mean, in the agricultural age, agricultural production was worth the most, and then machines became the most valuable. And what's happening now is that digital things with no apparent physical existence have become the most valuable. And so what we're seeing is a struggle to who can be the firms that can take advantage of this amazing technology to create value for customers. And another illustration of, in a completely different sector, Roche Pharmaceuticals, a new CEO took over in 2016, and he came into the firm and asked, what's going on in this firm? And he was told, we can't get anything done. We can't get anything done. And he asked why, and they told him that the processes were just so overwhelming that it was impossible to get things done. And it was, in some sense, a very different case from Microsoft. Microsoft had a very combative culture, and it did not have a focus on customers. It was focused on making money. Roche already had those elements in place. It had the focus on the customer. It had a very collaborative culture, but they couldn't get anything done because of the massive bureaucratic processes that they had inherited over many, many years. And so he realized, Bill Anderson, that they would have to have radical change. He was sobered by the fact that for the previous 10 years, they had been systematically simplifying processes. So after 10 years of simplifying processes, they still couldn't get anything done. So he said, we have to do something different. We can't just simplify. We have to have radical change. And so we don't know where this will lead. We don't know how long it will take. But we know we have to do something different because we have basically only 3 drugs, and they are going off patent in the next very near future. We need 20 new drugs if we are going to survive as an organization, and we don't have an organization that's capable of doing that. And so they started to introduce radical change. What they found was that they had processes which were totally useless. Somewhat in line with the Bullshit Jobs book that I was talking about. They had a forecasting process, forecast sales on a monthly basis. Now, they didn't need forecasts on a monthly basis. At most, they needed them on a quarterly basis. So why did you have a very costly monthly sales forecast that took 2 days of the senior management's time? And so they said, look, we're going to stop all monthly forecasts. We'll have 1 quarterly forecast, so that's 2/3 of saved. And in the quarterly forecast, instead of spending 2 days arguing about it and ending up with something that's exactly the same, we'll spend 1 hour on the forecast and spend the next 12 hours figuring out what would be a sensible process, what would be a sensible process for handling forecasts, radically different, radically simpler, radically more effective than what we have now. And going through everything in the organization like that. They looked at teams and they found that the average span of control was 2. Every manager had 2 employees reporting to him. So you had this myriad of tiny little teams, thousands and thousands of managers in this 50,000 person organization, hugely ineffective, hugely costly. And so they got rid of most of those managerial positions. Now the span of control is about 20. So you have teams of 50 and 3 leads within that 50-person organization. That can handle a much bigger challenge than these tiny 3-person teams. And people who'd been managers in the past were no longer managers. Now they were actually doing constructive work as part of a team. And of course, some of the managers didn't accept that. They left. That's fine. Good riddance, and we can move on and have a sensible organization. So they've had massive, massive changes. Their goal is to have increased value to customers by 10 times, an almost impossible goal, and to reduce the cost to society of generating that in terms of health by half. So 10 times the value at half the cost. That's the track they're on. So it's a difficult and almost impossible task, but that is the kind of thing that is happening in the organizations that are undertaking this. And the challenge for people in the middle of the organization is what to do. Many of you, as we saw, are in organizations which are not run in this way, maybe not even trying to be run in this way. You have several choices. You can be you may be predicting that maybe a new CEO will come, maybe a new leadership will emerge. And as in Microsoft, the agile teams that had been built up in the period before Satya Nadella, they became the leaders in the new organization. And so that is one game plan, is to be part of the future when it emerges. The other alternative is go somewhere else, go somewhere which is being run in this different way, which is more productive, more profitable, more fun for those doing the work, and a better way of carrying on in the organization. And this tool that we have here is about mapping this journey. If you look at this picture, it's almost impossible to think, well, what is going on in that scheme of things? What is happening? If we can split it up into the dimensions which are happening, you can then see what is going on in the organization. And so you can, I've sent this to the organizers, and I hope they'll distribute this to you as part of the conference. You can use this diagnostic tool to navigate your journey and in your team, in your unit or your firm. You can use it to look at the past. Where were you 5 years ago? Where are you today? Where do you hope to be in 5 years' time? You can use it to get different viewpoints. One of the Bank of the West in America, they got the managers and the staff to fill in this, and they found out that they had very different views as to where the organization was, not surprisingly. But that then enabled to have a discussion. Well, why does the manager think it's this, and why do the staff think it's that? And they could start to have a discussion about how to rectify that. And use it flexibly. If the categories don't fit your particular sector, I mean, if you're in household appliances, it's not going to be the same as in pharmaceuticals. You may need to adjust the categories to fit your sector. So use it flexibly, but use it as a way to understand where you are in this huge transition that's happening, whether we want it or not, whether we like it or not. It's happening all around us. And so that is the message that I come to you today, that here is a tool that you can use to navigate in your organization. And and final go round in the small group, why don't you go into a small group and see, do you think this tool could help you in your organization to figure out where you are in this transition and what steps you should then take to lead into the future. So let's take a minute or so in the group, and then we can take some questions about what this whole presentation is about. Okay? You may not be able to read the fine print here, but I hope you've got the general gist of what we're talking about. Okay, let's take some questions or some comments about this way of looking at the business, which I think is crucial for Agile, because if you're in a firm that's operating in the old way, the Agile team's destiny is limited. If you're in this new way, if you can get into this new way, the prospects look very, very different. But how does it look in your group? Any questions, comments, thoughts? Well, you've taken the first step. You've opened the conversation. You can suggest how you see the situation. You can ask Buster, how does he see the situation? You can explain to him some of the thinking behind this. These are not random questions. You can show him the article that will circulate to all the members of this conference, and the book will be published in December, and you can share the book with him. And I offer many articles in Forbes about this thinking, and you can direct him to that, and you can get together with other colleagues and see, does this make sense? Where do we fit into this scheme of things? What does our future look like, given what's happening in the world around us? But you've taken the first step, which is the most important. You've actually opened the dialogue, and that's how the discussion happens in any organization.
Because I can ask the question now, because I have a mic. And before I move to those questions, I'm going to add one mic question, because I have a mic. And this is, I have this conversation with the CEO of the company, and he says, that would be the last decision I can make. So there are stakeholders who make the decision, and the moment I make this decision, this is the last decision. So, I can go to CEO, but he reports to stakeholders. So how do they make the decision? Because you're giving the examples from the companies that are on the market, and how do those happen?
Yeah. There are other stakeholders than the customer, obviously, and they have to be satisfied. This is more about which is the most important, which stakeholder deserves primacy. And in the capitalist system, if you're not satisfying your customer, you're not generating revenue, and you'll never be able to satisfy any of the other customers. You'll never be able to pay your staff. You'll never be able to give benefits to the shareholders. You'll never be able to do what you need to do for the environment. And so first is to get value to the customer. That is the be-all and the end-all. And then you have to persuade other stakeholders that is going to lead to their gains also. So Microsoft goes to the stock market and says, we are not going to give primacy to you. We're going to give primacy to the customer, and that will lead to benefits for you in due course. And that turned out to be true, and so stock market is duly grateful, and so now Microsoft is worth $1.2 trillion more. So that's how stakeholders are dealt with, by persuading them that this is a much more effective way of running an organization, much better for everyone, but it's a different dynamic from focusing on, I'm going to do this for you, specifically for you. You get the benefits as a result of what you're doing, not the direct cause of it.
You mentioned the environment, and I just had two questions regarding the environment, so I'm going to find them. And one is from Utah, is if the customer is the sole focus of value creation, what if customer asks for a value that is not aligned with our ethics on morals? And there was a second one, which is super close to this one. What is is your position regarding companies which are supposedly customer-centric, but in turn harm other stakeholders, state, environment, infrastructure? So basically the same question about other stakeholders.
Yeah. Well, if the customers ask you to do something that's immoral or illegal, my suggestion would be to say no. This is not about simply going along with. You obviously have to have a code of conduct to do things which are ethical and moral. And as I say, in the environment, it has to be part of what the firm is doing, but not as the central goal. If the firm sets out to solve the environmental problem as the be-all and end-all, it will end up not making money, and it will end up not surviving, and so the environment will suffer as a result of that. So the idea is to focus on the customer, generate enough resources so that you're able to help the environment. And what you see, the highly successful firms are among the leaders in contributing to the environment because they can, because they're very wealthy and are able to make the contributions that firms that are specifically focused on the environment often are cash-strapped and cannot do what they want to do.
Yeah, speaking about the successful companies, I get the one from Anonymous, and it goes like, Steve, how do you see companies like Google on this trajectory? To me, it seems like that started in the new way and reverted back to the old way. So I guess this is about the Google moving to the old way. I don't know who is the question, is that or the people who voted on that? That's Anonymous.
Off the record, I would agree. I think it's disappointing in some ways what's happened at Google. I haven't worked with them closely in the last couple of years, so I can't comment on it directly, but I certainly worry when I listen to the CEO. It doesn't sound like the Google that I used to know. And when it was explicitly committed to doing the right thing. And that seems to be way, way in the background, and huge emphasis on exploiting their position in the digital world. And so, yeah, I share those concerns about Google.
So the idea would be that they're moving back on your two dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, a bit like SRI, which they were quite advanced at one period and now sliding back into the old way of doing things. And the diagnostic tool gives you a way to picture that, to describe it in specific terms of what's actually happening in the organization.
All right. Okay, I get a question from Łukasz, and this goes like this. What's the relation of digital revolution and customer-centric? For me, there are two separate revolutions, and I do not understand on why we combine them.
Well, they are mutually supportive. You do see firms that are hugely successful, which aren't involved in digital at all. Costco is an example of that, which is a consumer sort of supermarket firm that is not particularly digital, but is totally focused on delivering value to customers, laser focused on, and they've been hugely successful. What happened, though, is that firms have found, well, first of all, you can't be successful in digital unless you are focused on the customer. And so when you marry the two, you get so much more. So Costco, if it actually got involved more actively in digital, it would be able to generate even more benefits. And in fact, they have been successful because they've expanded geographically. Now they're running out of countries to expand into, and so they may have to either change their business or use digital to have a different kind of business. So that is a challenge that they will be facing. But they are mutually supportive, so it's not, they happened at the same time, they are not the same thing, but they certainly interact with each other and support each other dramatically.
All right, thank you. And the next one is, in your opinion, what will be the next evolutionary step after digital, and I have no idea, digital era, where it disappeared? Anyway, what will be the next revolution?
Well, we have our hands full with the digital revolution. Most firms are still struggling to deal with that. I think new materials and evolution of of artificial intelligence, that will end up making dramatic changes, things we can't even imagine today. So I think we are really just at the beginning of the digital revolution. That will go on for another 20, 50, 100 years maybe.
And we might find out that our work will change a little bit by then. All right, 3 more minutes, and I have a lot of more questions. So most of them probably will need to be asked during the break, which is coming soon. The next one is, have you studied how our Chinese companies run? Firms like Huawei, Xiaomi, Gree, I hope that I spelled them correctly, extremely successful in their segments.
Yeah, I mean, we have much to learn from Asia. And in many ways, the successful firms are pursuing exactly the same strategy, digital technology, customer focus. Some of their management have different patterns. You do see in Asia what's called the good dictator kind of leader. Someone who is totally dictatorial, demanding absolute loyalty, but who has personally the highest moral standards and has a benevolent stance towards the employees who are his slaves, if you like. You see that pattern in a number of very successful Asian countries and companies, and you don't see that very much in Europe or the US. So there are other patterns, and time will tell whether that is will evolve in Europe or the US. The dictator-like CEOs that we've had in the US certainly have not had the highest moral standards and have not had a benevolent stance towards their staff, and so that pattern hasn't been available to us. But if there were such people as CEOs, it would be interesting to see what happened.
Okay, I'm not going to go into the conversation about the morals of the leaders in this stage, especially that we are being recorded. The last one, at least from the time perspective, it sounds pretty interesting for me. So 2000 to 2014 on Agile, and then back onto industrial. How come Agile didn't generate enough value to convince the board to continue? So why? I guess this was about this example we had about the company that moved to 2014, get some result on 2014, and then fall back to a more industrial approach.
Sorry, I'm missing the company.
So you gave the example about the company. You didn't name the company, as far as I remember, that did the transformation from 2000 to 2014, and then they fall back to the.
That was SRI International. Yeah.
Okay, so the question is how come? So what was missing in the transformation that they fall back to the previous way of working? So how to make it, stick for longer, the change?
Well, as I suggested, I think Kurt did not get on the same page as the board of directors. So the board of directors tolerated him, but they found it very chaotic. And they were mainly military people who were used to very sort of top-down, hierarchical, very orderly, taking orders and following things. And here was this organization which had teams and communities flowing around the organization and new ideas popping up everywhere. To them, it seemed like total chaos. Of course, there were huge innovations that happened, and they made huge amounts of money, much more than they'd ever made before, but that was not sufficient to persuade them that they should continue like that. And so when Kurt left, they appointed somebody who was a very sort of military, top-down, bureaucratic kind of person. And so that kind of personality will start to take decisions that actually push the firm back into the old way. And with the wisdom of hindsight, maybe Kurt could and should have spent more time trying to educate the board, trying to show the board that this was the way of the future. This was normal. This was not something aberrant, not something irrational, but simply the way of the future. And but he didn't do that, and so was appointed. But as I say, it has a potentially happy ending. They saw what happened. Revenues declined drastically under that approach, and so now the board has appointed someone in the same mold as Kurt. So they're back on that track to get to move forward.
So the bottom line to Agile coaches and Scrum Masters here will be, you need not just to convince the management, you need to convince your CEO, and you need to convince the board of directors as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that's easy. Okay, we get more questions, but we're running out of time, and I'm between you and the coffee break. So first of all, thank you very much, Steve.